Hello, I'm User-Friendly Assistant, and in this video I wanted to talk about this. This little menu down here is to loop these envelopes. So if it's off and you hit a MIDI note, by the way, I'm just triggering the MIDI note with my keyboard with this little light on up here. You'll just get one envelope and that's it. Versus turning loop on is basically going to turn it into an LFO. So you can think of this like operator having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 LFOs. And they're super snappy. There's a couple other settings here. There's loop, so that's just going to freely loop as soon as it's done. This little number here, that's going to be how long the sustain goes on for. But outside of that, it's just going to loop as soon as the envelope is over. Beat and sync are basically going to be the same. It's just one of them is going to be, I think it's sync, is going to be quantized with the transport. Outside of that, they're basically the same. And then trigger is going to make it so if you had you can kind of hear how the envelopes are going over top of each other. It's a little bit more apparent with a second oscillator versus none. It's just turning it into a triggered envelope as opposed to a gated envelope, which is how most envelopes usually are. But even though most of them are gated, at least, I don't know if this applies for everybody, but I always sort of intuitively think of, like I expect envelopes to work the way triggered envelopes do. But the thing I wanted to talk about was the looping thing. So just as a little example, this is something that you can do in theory. So actually, before I go on with this, something to keep in mind is, let's say this is looping. So we have A looping and B looping. You're only going to hear oscillator B when oscillator A is open, because of this particular algorithm. D's feeding into C's, feeding into B's, feeding into A. Versus this one, you can always hear all four oscillators. So now, if we sync these, do like that. Same with the pitch envelope filter and LFO. Those are all basically the same. You have this looping ability here. So I'm going to do that. Now we have a kick drum. And this one, we now have a snare. And now we have an electronic dance music track. And I have a suspicion that this is why operator is not included in standard or intro, is because you can make an entire sick electronic track with it. And now you know that. Anyway, more interesting, in my opinion, stuff to do is this sort of thing. In fact, maybe we won't loop this one. Let's just leave this big bass. Do another one. And then the same thing, like I said before, with the pitch envelope, you can do the same stuff. Which is, you can, like I said before, since it's kind of like having a bunch of envelopes, you can sort of use this one as your LFO for the pitch, and then have your other LFO doing something else, which also has its own envelope as well. So from there, if you hit Command G, you'll group it, and now you have macros. So if you just go through and assign all of the decays, actually, do I want that one? I don't think I want that one yet. To one macro. That's cool, but I prefer where stuff was sort of all over the place rhythmically. So if you come into map, you'll see this little menu pop up, and now you can sort of offset the decay time a little bit for each one of these. So that way they end up being a little bit different. So that big sort of impact that you get at first, that's due to the peak. So it's going all the way up, and then during this decay stage is coming back down. So you can take that or leave it. So a note on what's happening right now, because I feel like I've tried recording this video a couple times, and one of the reasons is because it ends up being so long because of how much time I spend doing exactly what I'm doing. Literally just pressing the note over and over again, listening to stuff, changing something a little bit, and pressing a note again. If I have like an exact sort of sound in my head that I'm looking for, you know, like a kick drum or something, usually there's generally some sort of recipe for that, and you can do it pretty quickly. But when it gets into this stuff where you're sort of looking for weird, interesting new sounds, despite what a lot of tutorials might show, most of the time it's just this, like it's sitting there slowly turning knobs, listening to it over and over again. And a lot of the time, this is going to sound like I'm defending this awful sound, but a lot of the time, it's not really going to sound that great. At least for me, most of the time, it doesn't sound great. So you can bring in a bunch of effects, and I've actually talked about this before in other demonstrations and videos and stuff like this, where if you have compression or reverb, delay, all this sort of stuff in there at the beginning, then you can sort of make changes and adjustments based on that sort of processing. So just as like an example, I guess, yeah, we'll just do. So before, where we had talked about that crazy peak thing, how loud it got, it's much more apparent with the compressor off. With the compressor on, because the compressor is doing what the compressor does, you can still hear it, but it's a different thing altogether. It almost sounds, if you listen closely, it almost sounds like a little hi-hat or something coming through. Versus with it off, you can hear that it's actually like getting louder, and it's happening quite a bit slower. Like I would almost say that there's that sort of hi-hat-ish sound you're hearing may almost be more the compressor that you're hearing than the operator. Anyway, the point is when you're doing this sort of thing, especially with weird glitch experimental sound design stuff, really try to be patient and, you know, be critical or whatever. Like, if it doesn't sound good, it just doesn't sound good. But at this stage, you've done quite a bit of work, like between going through, you know, turning loop on, adjusting these things here, assigning some macros, and it's like, this still doesn't sound very good. Just keep messing with it a little bit longer. And I'm probably about to, you know, prove myself wrong here. This is never going to end up actually sounding good. But a lot of times it does. And a lot of times the reason you get the super interesting stuff is because you've kind of spent all of this time slowly turning knobs and looking for sounds and stuff. So all of it's to say is just, it takes a while, literally, you know, to kind of go through and listen to all this stuff. So we have this macro that's assigned to the decay, and in the map section, they're kind of offset a little bit. And this will be something you can come back and play with over and over again to try and get it right. But you can do the same thing with the attack, because that's also going to affect how long it takes for this to loop over and over again. And you can do the same sort of thing if you want, just assign them all to the same macro, and then come in here and offset them a little bit. So the attack, and I'm pretty sure the decay as well. Yeah, the decay actually goes up to 60 seconds, and the attack goes on for 20 seconds. So that's actually a really, really long time. And if you actually turn it up to that long, you may not actually hear it doing anything, which isn't always a bad thing, but it's worth keeping in mind. And again, you can do the same thing with the filter. I probably shouldn't get into all that, but I would say this is probably something I would leave, just because that can be kind of useful to have full control over, because then you can sort of do one of these things and sort of, actually let's assign this to macro 3 and the decay to macro 3. So now and then come in, decrease that so it continues to loop pretty quickly. So now you have a sort of way to introduce the sound if you wanted to. And you could even you could probably even do this to where it's turning the envelope down. So the amount that is being sent to the filter from the envelope, we'll turn that down as everything else is going up. So what do we want? We want this at 100 and this at 0. So now that's interesting. I didn't realize that that happened. I guess it sends a gate release of some sort. So what I'm just mentioning here right now is that right now it's being sent 100%. So that should loop forever. Right? But if I go all the way up to 100% and the envelope goes to 0, so this little percentage thing right here goes to 0, it'll stop looping. I've never done this before, so I never really noticed it one way or the other. It's just kind of interesting that's how that works. Anyway, now what? So the last thing I wanted to mention is what I had talked about before, where this can kind of act like a VCA. So if we do some drums, I'm just going to make this really complicated thing really quick. Great. And then I'm just doing this so that way the everything lines up. So as it is right now, none of this stuff is synced. So it's kind of all over the place with the rhythm. Again, this is going to be for this algorithm in particular. If we now turn sync on, we have something that's sort of tying the rhythm together a little bit more, that's not completely out of time. Most of the time, I don't work in sync with a lot of the stuff I do, but I'll spend a really long time going through and sort of setting things just so it's barely going with the rhythm. But for the most part, like if I was making something quickly and whatever, this is kind of a good way to do it, because then you're still getting this wonkiness from the looped envelopes, but it's in time in some way. So this would be something that would be interesting to sort of modulate independently of these two. So just as an example, if we do an expression control, actually I think I have a pre-randomized one. So now we could randomize that and randomize this. And then this one, if we will kind of get not only the sort of variation in the envelope, but also variation in which direction and how much. So that's too much and it's happening too often for me. One thing you can do is you can group this and then do this sort of thing and assign a key. So now you can sort of trigger which one you want to get the random from. This would probably be something that I would put on a separate track and kind of painstakingly go through, you know, like click over here, click this, click map, click this, click that, and assign it that way. And then, well, actually I didn't want to do that because I wanted to duplicate this first. And then this one, offset it a little bit. Then we can map this one to that control. So now we can select whether the envelopes, whether those are getting modulated or this pitch thing here. Yeah. So that'll modulate the envelopes. This will modulate the pitch thing. Hey, why isn't that working? That's supposed to work. Because these are wrong. Come on. Something else to keep in mind is down here, you have this time thing that I talked about before. If it gets too crazy, I think you can kind of use that to slow down how fast it gets going. Now maybe it's worth kind of getting into just some quick effects, the usual sort of drum bus, whatever, over the top thing. Maybe super short delay. Now, if you don't feel like side chaining the kick and all that, we could just do an auto pan with that off. Invert it. So those are actually, that's a pretty long time for an attack. I'm going to shorten these quite a bit so we get more looping. That's basically just noise at this point. I feel like it sounded better before. I'm just saying, I feel like that's like a pretty sort of standard, you know, like compress the drums really hard, and that should relatively pass as like, wow, you're good at that. you barely need yeah, like if you just did a little bit of modulation on that. And the point I was going to make is like what I was talking about before, where it's like, this still sounds bad, this still sounds bad. Just kind of continuing to just mess with it, because if you had restarted, chances are you wouldn't have ended up right here, because all I've been doing is I've more or less been randomly turning knobs and adding effect. And just turning that course up. Now, if you're really good with FM, you may have just kind of like known that, but FM is sort of notoriously deep. And I don't know, like I feel like for the most part, if I'm messing with FM, I'm more or less randomly turning knobs. I'm going to leave this right here because I'm going to put this on Patreon so people can mess with it. And I don't want to adjust any of this and screw it up from here, because I think that's actually a pretty cool starting spot for somebody. Yeah. Yeah, like just a little bit of modulation on this. Maybe rather than just random on these couple of macros, you actually went in and sort of did the automation correctly, and then some automation on this auto pan. And you'll have a bro track. Come to think of it, actually, I don't know that maybe we just can't hear it because of all of this. I'm just trying to think. I don't think all of this stuff that I originally wanted to talk about with the envelopes is really coming through in this example. Let's turn this off for a second. Where's the other one? I think that's probably wise, because sync. No, that's adding stuff. Like there's definitely, you might have to sort of massage it a little bit to get it back out. But that's definitely adding something interesting. I think. It just wasn't coming through because I did this. I did this talking about how, oh, look, it's like a VCA. You don't, you know, you can do it all there. And then still added this auto pan. That's where I'm going to leave it. Okay. Yeah, I'll put this on Patreon.